above reproach means not given to drunkenness. And straight away here we have a test. It's a kind of test of faith. What are we going to do with this, given that most people who aspire to Christian leadership are not usually very obviously problem drinkers? The Pharisee approach to Scripture simply says, if you don't normally get drunk, great, tick that box and move on. Jesus' approach to the Scriptures and to righteousness in general is to ask what lies beneath a statement like this in a letter from Paul to Timothy, and then to ask, so what? It comes as a shock to us to realise that pagan worship in the ancient world often deliberately employed drunkenness. This was maybe what made in Acts chapter 2 verse 13, they have had too much wine, such a cutting retort from Jews upon other Jews. Greeks and Romans in those days would deliberately get drunk in order to enhance their worship. It looked like these guys had been experimenting with the same technique. Not so, said Peter. If we read Proverbs 23, 19 to 35, the cost of drunkenness is clearly spelt out. There is the drowsiness that leads to poverty, verse 21. The sacrificing of the truth, wisdom, discipline and understanding, verse 23, which are all essential to living real life. And of course, along with them, real essential relationships will be sacrificed. They will be a source of misery rather than rejoicing, verses 24 and 25. Now, over and again, the truth of this is proved wherever alcohol takes a hold on someone's life. But this passage also talks about the attraction of alcohol, verses 33 and onwards. The drunk has a feeling of enhanced perception, of being invulnerable. It's not hard to see how people could confuse this entirely false sense of enhanced perception with an encounter with a higher reality, a kind of self-induced out-of-body experience. It seems that something like that is going on in Daniel chapter 5 and verses 1 to 7. At Belshazzar's feast we can see drunkenness being used as a tool of pagan worship. Now you might want to pause the video moment here and ask, where does the world around me go to escape from reality or to encounter a different reality? And have any of those techniques found their way into the worship of the church? What is deliberate drunkenness doing in Genesis 19 verses 30 to 38? Or again in Habakkuk 2, 15 and 16. Inducing drunkenness in others gets them to let down their guard. Getting ourselves drunk, we are deliberately letting down our own guard, morally and spiritually. And then we do find out why it's called the demon drink, because demons love to find a place unguarded. So again, I want to pause here and ask about my own favourite means of switching off, and whether or not I am deliberately dropping my guard in those moments. Because the last thing God's people need are leaders who are in the habit of taking holidays from reality. Let's go back to Proverbs again, this time to Proverbs 31, verses 4 to 7. What's the difference here? Why is it not for kings to drink wine or crave beer, but it's okay for the people at the very bottom of the pile? Well, the poor are the ones who need an escape from reality because they aren't in a position to change it. But their leaders, their kings, are the ones in a position to make a difference. But of course they won't, verse 5, if they're on the lash themselves. In Isaiah 56, verses 9 to 12, you have a picture of God's people vulnerable and defenceless. Why? Because their watchmen, their overseers, are basically just out for themselves. That picture comes sharply into New Testament focus in 1 Corinthians. a letter written to a largely Gentile church where drunken worship was part of the background culture. Reading 1 Corinthians 11, 17 to 22, it seems to have entered into the worship of the Christian church too. When you read 1 Corinthians 6, 1 to 11, notice how Paul highlights the disturbing lack of wisdom and understanding in this church. Remember Proverbs 23, 19 to 35? And then notice how he reminds them that things like drunkenness were part of their former life, but don't belong among them now. Read 1 Corinthians 10, 14 to 11:1, and see how Paul is intent on them keeping separate the worship of Jesus Christ from the pagan worship around them. So I want to ask, do we always do that? Or does the world's way of worship have a way of getting into the church? If you have been, thank you for joining in.